So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to SecTor 2022. Session feedback can be provided via the swap card platform. During the Q&A, please wait for the microphone before asking your questions so we can capture the audio for the recording. You are in room 714AB, and our next session is Azure AD and Microsoft 365 Security Fundamentals with Peter Carson.
Thanks, Raphael. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. So my goal over the next hour is to defeat that lunch that you just had and keep you awake for the next 60 minutes. We'll see how that goes. It was pretty good. I'm just going to start with a quick intro on myself. I'm Peter Carson, president of a local company called Envision IT. We also have a software product called Extranet User Manager. I'm a Microsoft MVP, so I've been doing a lot of conferences, speaking for a lot of years, and open source work and different projects and things like that. All my contact details are up here on the slide. If you look down in the right corner of that eum.co, it's a shortcut to our website. If you go to the resources events, you'll find this event, and the slide deck that I'm presenting here today is already up there. So if you want to grab it, I encourage you to go ahead and do that and go from there. Okay, quick agenda, what we're going to cover over the next hour or so. We've done the intros. We're going to go into a bit of a deeper dive on the session overview and the goals for today. And then we're going to spend a lot of time in Azure Active Directory, now called part of the Entra family. Microsoft loves to rename things and launch new portals. I don't know if everybody's seen that just yet. It's confusing, but you can go to two places and manage your Azure Active Directory now. Also some time on the sensitivity side. Purview is the new Microsoft name for their compliance, Azure Information Protection, that whole side of things. Again, just decided to rename it this summer. Away we go from there. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on licensing. It is a messy topic. Microsoft also makes that very confusing. But I do have some resources that help guide you through that so you can understand, okay, the different features that I'm talking about here today, what would you need in your organization in order to be able to leverage that? I want to start with a quick poll. I'm assuming I'll get most hands up, but if you use Microsoft 365 and Azure Active Directory in your organization today, you can just put your hand up for me, just to get a sense of the room. Okay, and then if you can leave your hand up or put it back up if you are a global administrator in that tenant. Okay, so maybe 1/3 global admins, 2/3 general staff from that point of view. Awesome. Okay, so let's talk about the session goals. I keep walking away from the mic here. I'm just going to try and stay here so everybody can hear me properly. Obviously, Azure Active Directory is the core of your identity management and your security if you're working in the Microsoft cloud. So that's the core piece that we're going to be talking about here. And there are quite a number of different flavors and features of that. So we will talk about licensing and what impact different choices you make from that perspective come in from that. But there are a lot of other products like Purview that I just mentioned that are part of the family and bring in pieces of that as well. I'm not a pure security person. I would consider myself more of a cloud architect and a designer, and user experience is really important to me. And it should be important from a security point of view as well, because if you make things too secure, sure, you've unplugged the computer and nobody can access it and it's nice and secure, you got to find that balance point. And that applies in a lot of things that we're going to be talking about here today. Everybody understands the importance of multi-factor authentication, but saying we have to have MFA for everybody all the time doesn't always make sense. And that may sound heretical in a security conference, but when we talk about maybe people that aren't your staff, they're coming in as guests into your tenant, and maybe they're doing something very low impact from a security point of view, like taking a training course. Should they have to go through MFA registration in order to come in and do that? There is a barrier to entry there, and you need to decide and pick the right level from that point of view. So some of that comes down to sensitivity. What is it that people are trying to do? What applications are they trying to access? And what's in those applications? Is there PII, PHI data in there that's at a higher sensitivity level? Okay, maybe we're going to make different decisions based on that. Or for those of you that put your hand up as a global administrator, we should probably have rules in place that tighten up the security a little bit more in terms of what you need to go through to authenticate, because you have the keys to the kingdom and you can do anything from that point of view. And as I already mentioned, you want to factor in not only your staff, but external users as well. No organization is an island. Everybody collaborates externally, whether that means you're just attaching documents to emails and sending them out to people, or you're inviting people into shared spaces in SharePoint and Teams and a lot of the different Microsoft products. You need to factor that into your model as well. I should have mentioned as well, I'm not going to hold questions for a formal Q&A. We will take, if we've got time, questions at the end, but there is mics here. And Raphael, I think you have a mobile mic as well. So if you've got a question as we're going through, feel free to put your hand up. I do like it interactive. It makes it interesting for everybody from that point of view. Okay, so Entra. I wasn't even cognizant of this product name until I was prepping for this talk. But I'm just used to going to portal.azure.com and going to Active Directory and managing things from there. I'm not going to be going down into the permissions management or the Entra verified ID side. They are actually quite interesting to me. I didn't get time to dig into them from a prep for this talk point of view. So the focus is really going to be around the Azure Active Directory side of the house. So let's start with Azure AD Versions. What are the different flavors of Azure AD that you may have in place in your organization? And it doesn't have to be an all or nothing. You can mix different license levels within your organization if it's appropriate. And the first thing is Azure AD is completely free. Any one of you can go to the Microsoft portal and say, I want to create a new tenant and have an Azure AD tenant. You can even invite guests in and start running your business, your hobby, whatever you're under that. And you can use that free version. There's no cost whatsoever in order to do that. If you sign up for an Office 365 tenant, obviously it needs Azure AD under the hood. If you don't have one already, it'll get provisioned as part of your sign-up process. And depending on the subscription level that you have for 365, you may have what's called the Office 365 version of Azure AD, which honestly I don't see a lot of difference between the free and the Office 365 version. It used to be that things like MFA originally in the lower tiers didn't exist at all, which is really bad. You had to buy a premium level of Azure AD to get multi-factor authentication. Then they rolled it in 365 and they said, hey, we're just going to put it across all of the tiers of Azure AD because it's so important to have that in place. So if you have one of those first tiers, you get the option of what's called security defaults. And it doesn't give you the full richness of conditional access policies that we're going to be diving into later in the session, but it does turn on multi-factor authentication for all of your users. And it also blocks legacy authentication protocols, which is a clear attack vector from an attack point of view. So that's good if you've got that. I do strongly encourage most, if not all, organizations, though, to consider at least Azure AD P1. You get conditional access policies. We'll talk about other features that you get as part of that, sort of as a base level. And you may decide, hey, Azure AD P2 makes sense for us. And towards the end of the talk, I'll talk about the licensing bundle. Microsoft has this convoluted, you bought this SKU, you get this with it. There's a lot of different ways to slice and dice how you actually get the premium version of Azure Active Directory. So if we look at those two and say, okay, that's our baseline. We should probably be on either P1 or P2 as an organization. What do I get as part of that premium P1 plan? Well, I get conditional access policies that lets me get a lot more granular around things like multi-factor authentication. Do I have different rules for administrators versus staff versus guests, which we're going to talk about as part of that. You can only do that if you're at least at the P1 level from that point of view. There's a bunch of other topics that we're not going to have time to get into, things like hybrid identities, password protection, where you can say, hey, these are banned passwords. No one's allowed to use PASSWORD as their password. Okay, we're good there. Those conditional access policies can use group membership, the geography that the person's coming from, the device that they're on, can all be part of that. I actually didn't update this next point. The Azure Information Protection is now called Purview. That's the compliance side. You can actually use things like sensitivity labels to say, hey, if somebody's accessing sensitive content, then I'm going to apply a different policy as they come in through there. What's the step up to P2? Obviously, you get everything that's in the P1 side. You get identity protection. What that is Microsoft is using signals not just from your tenant, but all tenants globally, literally billions of authentications a day coming in through that. And they're looking for trends and behaviors from a security point of view and bringing that in onto your tenant as well. Say, hey, if we see a growing threat or trend more broadly, we can activate that through identity protection. There's other things too, like, hey, the same person is signing in through two geographies. Is that a risky behavior? Can we factor that into our policies as part of that? Privileged identity management, again, I won't have time to dive too deep into it. I quite like this feature. It's the idea that if you have elevated permissions, global admins is one example, but there'd be others within your organization, that doesn't need to be always on. You don't need to always have that permission. Privileged identity management says, okay, you can build a rule for that, and you can request that permission, and then somebody else in your organization has to approve it and say, hey, for the next 8 hours, your admin account is turned on and you have global admin rights. And when that 8 hours is done, that's gone again, because it doesn't really make sense to have it sitting there 7/24 and available to you. Access reviews are the ability to force group owners and business folks to review to say, hey, do these accounts still make sense? Should they still be in there? And it's got some triggers like people that haven't logged in a long time, things like that can look for inactive accounts. And then entitlement management is a way to package up groups and applications and everything else. It's almost an onboarding. You can use it both for internal as well as external onboarding scenarios. So that's sort of the two flavors between P1 and P2. So let's talk now about the types of users that you have in Azure Active Directory. I kind of put them into three groups. And typically one organization would only have two or maybe one of these. And so the leftmost two, the member synced and cloud only, are really how you set up your Azure Active Directory. You know, if you're like most organizations that have been around for a number of years, you have an on-premise Active Directory infrastructure. And that was probably one of your primary Microsoft identity providers back in the day. And now what's been done is that's been synced up into the cloud, so you have sort of shadow copies of those accounts in Azure Active Directory that are connected to those on-premise accounts. So that's what we call the synced scenario. Now there's a couple of options that you can do from an authentication point of view. You can do what's called password hash synchronization. Don't call it password synchronization because people get freaked and they say you're going to take our on-premise passwords and put them in the cloud. That sounds scary. You're not. You're taking the one-way hash from the on-premise and putting that in the cloud. So somebody in the cloud can type in the correct password and in Azure AD can validate that. You can't reverse that without a lot of work to say, okay, get me the actual password that's being used on premises as part of that. That was nice because it's pretty simple and you don't need any connections between your cloud and your on-premise other than the Connect tool that does that sync up. So if your internet connection at your corporate data center goes down, your cloud doesn't go down. You can still authenticate and work fine from that point of view. Pass-through authentication and federation do have a dependency back to your on-premise infrastructure. Pass-through is you're authenticating in the cloud, and there's an agent on-premise that says, okay, take that authentication request, process it in our on-premise Active Directory, and then give the response back to the cloud. Federation, typically we would have seen Active Directory federation services back in the day. We're seeing a lot less of that now. Maybe you use Okta as your primary identity provider, so you want to federate to Okta. That's all fine from that point of view. Just make sure that your organization is of sufficient size and you've got sufficient redundancy in your network, that you don't have one office with one ISP connection, and if it goes down, not only is your office down, but all of your cloud services are down as a result of that as well. The other way to mitigate that is to put that up into the cloud itself as well. And we've done that. We could probably be a cloud-only organization. Our company's only 20 people. We still have a few legacy virtual machines from a development point of view hanging around, so we still have an Active Directory. But what we've done is put our domain controllers up in Azure. So we actually have no data center anymore. We are fully cloud. We just haven't pulled that last piece of the plug and said, okay, our Azure AD accounts are actually cloud-only accounts, which is the second scenario. It only exists in the cloud. You can use a cloud password. You can still do federation. You could still say, hey, we still want Okta to be our authenticator, and your Microsoft Online login will redirect over to Okta, do the authentication, get your token back, and continue from there. The third one that's important to think about is the guest one. To say, hey, if we haven't closed the doors and we want to do things like adding external people to SharePoint sites or sharing my OneDrive content out or adding somebody to a Teams in the Microsoft 365, those are all things that are going to create guest accounts. And they're not standalone accounts. They're actually connected back to their own organizational Active Directory. So it's, again, almost like the synced. You've got a stub guest account in your Azure AD, but when they go to authenticate, they're actually going to use their own Microsoft 365 credentials. And it's nice because there's no passwords, no management from that point of view. From a guest perspective, it all happens back on the home tenant. And back in the day, when you invited a guest in and they didn't have their own organization and they didn't have a personal Microsoft account, Microsoft forced you to create this own, we called them zombie tenants, these sort of unmanaged Azure AD tenants for that organization, and they had password management and everything in there. You can still do that today, but as of about a month or two ago, by default, everybody who's a guest that doesn't have an organizational account goes through what's called a one-time passcode. So when you go to authenticate, instead of a password box, it says, hey, send me a code. You get an email from Microsoft with your 8-character code. You plug it in. That's your password for those 30 minutes, a one-time use. It's really simple and seamless. And back to my user experience point, it's good for the guests. I mean, you don't want people that are external to your organization having to call your help desk to figure out how to get into your Microsoft 365. It becomes really simple from a self-service point of view. You can also do federation to Google, to Facebook, to SAML, WSFed, through guest accounts as well. So that there's that option too from that perspective. Okay, so in that first scenario where you're syncing, you're using a tool called Azure AD Connect. It's freely available from Microsoft, and basically you deploy a component into your on-premise infrastructure, whether that's in your cloud or your data center, and it's basically looking at your on-premises Active Directory and syncing not only the users but the groups up into the cloud. So all the group management from an identity provider point of view that you've done on-premise, you can leverage that in the cloud and have that work well. There's actually two flavors of that as well. The original product was called Azure AD Connect. It was fairly heavyweight. We used it for a while. We had a dedicated VM that it was running on. Just in terms of it had its own database. It required a decent amount of horsepower for that. And it would sync everything back up from there. They then came out, I think about a year or two ago, with Connect Cloud Sync. And it's very lightweight. Most of the work actually gets done by a Microsoft SaaS service that's running up in the cloud. So you've just got an agent on-premise, and then it talks to the Microsoft service that talks to your Azure AD. It's not as powerful as the full Connect, so if you want to do things like password write-back, I mentioned you can do a password hash sync to take your password hash and put it up in the cloud. You can support self-service password reset in Azure AD, so when somebody changes their password in the cloud, it'll then push it back through Azure AD Connect to your on-premise Active Directory as well. You can't do that with Connect Cloud Sync. So you kind of have to decide, okay, what style of organization are we? Where do we want our identity to be mastered, and how much infrastructure do we want to devote to that? Whew, you can take a breath. I know I've only got 17 minutes in here, but we got a lot to cover. So if I'm talking too fast and you want me to slow down, pause, just let me know from that point of view. We're going to spend a fair bit of time on conditional access policies. So these are the features that come in Azure AD P1 and P2, and they're super important to be able to say, okay, for every authentication that comes in, what are the decisions that I'm going to make? And on the left, you see the signals. This is what Microsoft is able to ingest into conditional access policies, and you can write rules that makes use of those signals. So, who is it that's signing in? And where are they signing in geographically in the world? Do you want to block logins from certain parts of the world? You can do that through conditional access policies. What device are they coming in from? Is it a corporate Windows device? Is it a Mac? Is it an iOS, an Android device? What level of management is on it? Is it up to date from a virus scanning point of view and a corporate compliance point of view? That can all be done from a device perspective. And you can make different decisions based on what they're coming in through there. What are they trying to do? What application are they going to? And what's the sensitivity or importance of that application? And then the real-time risk, things like the identity protection, can look at those global signals and bring those in as part of that as well. So all those things come in, you write rules based on that, and you've got three choices from there. Am I going to force an MFA to happen right now? Am I going to just let them in because it's okay? Or am I going to outright block them and say, no, you're not allowed to come in? If we think about things like legacy authentication protocols that should be blocked entirely, it's a very easy one-line conditional access policy to say, anybody coming in from anywhere using these legacy protocols, just block them. And that eliminates that risk. Because what happens with legacy is that those older applications don't understand MFA, so if you leave that open, MFA won't get enforced in those scenarios, which makes it a prime target from a hacking point of view to say, hey, I'm going to use those old Exchange endpoints to try and get into your network, because I know that I'm not going to be challenged with MFA as part of that. Question here. I'll repeat your question if you want.
So look at the signals for authentication, but someone might be logged in for 6 to 8 hours. Do you continually check the signals to see if any of them changed during that period, or is it a one-time check and then you're in?
That's a good leading question for a couple slides ahead. So there is a lot of choices, things like, is there persistence in the session? When I close my browser and reopen, does it still live? How often do I recheck the credentials? Again, those can all be defined in the conditional access policies to say, okay, what's the lifetime of this? Maybe every hour I want to force a reauthentication to happen. Even within applications, I may have gone to a low sensitivity application and the decision in the policy was, I'm not going to do MFA, and then I go somewhere else that has highly sensitive data. It can actually, depending on the application, whether it supports it, will force a reauthentication and force an MFA in that scenario as part of that. You typically need to be in the Microsoft stack, like SharePoint does that, Exchange does that. A few of the other tools do that from that point of view. But yeah, great question. I listened to the Microsoft Keynote at RSA this summer. I wanted to grab a couple of sound bites out of it. And some scary stats here, more than 900 password attacks per second, up 2 times from last year. So it's not like the frequency is going down, the frequency is going up. So that just says to me, hey, if you're not doing MFA today, and it always surprises me when I come into an organization and they don't have a proper MFA strategy, they don't have conditional access policies, it's a little frightening, but it still happens today in 2022. So there's obviously attacks going on around that. The time when somebody's taking you through a phishing attack or through a device attack, hour plus time to be able to access your private data or to move laterally within your system. That's not a lot of time to respond from that point of view. There's actually some older stats from RSA that I've used in previous talks from 2020, equally scary, and they kind of lay out the groundwork. So feel free to use this particular one with your business folks back in your organization to say this is why we need to do MFA and conditional access properly. 1.2 million compromised accounts in 1 month in Azure AD. Yes, they have billions and billions of accounts. It's still a big number. But of those, 99.9% didn't have MFA, and they use legacy auth for both replay and password spray attacks. Close those 2 doors. Say, okay, we've got a blanket MFA policy and we block legacy authentication protocols. You're 1,000 times more secure than somebody that didn't do that. And I think those stats still hold today from that point of view. Okay. Probably old news for everybody here, but I just want to make sure we level set. From an MFA point of view, there's 3 main ways you can do that in Azure AD. You can do a voice phone call, you can do an SMS text code, or you can use an app. I love the app. It works really well. There's still talk about SIM hacking and stealing out there where somebody grabs your mobile number and can use that to get an SMS to bypass your MFA. You need to get the physical device from somebody to be able to do that with the application. But not only that, it's just actually easier to use. Like I'm an iPhone user, but it's equally easy on Android. I go to a login prompt, conditional access policy decides, hey, you need to go through MFA. I get a prompt right on my lock screen that says, hey, there's an authentication request. I touch it, I Face ID, goes into Authenticator, I do a second Face ID, and I'm done. I didn't have to type codes into a computer or do anything complicated as part of that. Back to the user experience point of view, it's really easy. The challenge is actually getting it set up. That's why I'm a little nervous sometimes to say, let's have a blanket MFA policy for guests, because getting them to figure out how to scan the QR code and get the app installed on their device and everything else, general public that maybe isn't experienced with that can be a real challenge. So really every account should require MFA, 2 exceptions that I see in there. We're going to talk about emergency accounts, like a break glass in a second, and also guests we've already touched on from there. One of the big blockers that we often see in organizations around blanket MFA is I'll do the air quotes, service accounts. These are regular user accounts in your Azure AD that are not used by people. They're used by some application that somebody wrote that hopefully stores a username and password somewhere secure, like an Azure Key Vault, may or may not, but doesn't have the ability to go through MFA. because there's no person behind the keyboard when that authentication happens. So you'll often see exclusions in conditional access policies to say, hey, exclude these dozen accounts because they're used for back-end processes and we can't do MFA on them. The answer to that is you've got to fix that application. You should use service principals, which are a whole different type of security object in Azure AD intended for that scenario. To say that's an application, not a person. And doesn't require MFA, has a whole different way of authenticating. Yes, you're going to have to modernize some of your applications to do that, and that may be difficult to do. So there may be a period of time where you do have to have those exclusions in. But you should be working to eliminate those and take those out altogether. So base recommendations. I'm going to share a article that I've got up on our website that has more detail on this here. But let's start with just creating an emergency account. So one thing you have to be careful about with conditional access policies is you can lock yourself out as an administrator. You may think you're creating a block access for a scenario you want to block, and you've actually blocked global admins from coming in, and then you've locked yourself out and you can't get back in. I haven't actually gone through that. I'm assuming you got to pick up the phone and talk to Microsoft support and prove who you are, and it's going to be days, not hours, to get your access back to get in from that point of view. So, I mean, you can always test your policies in report-only mode, and I encourage you to do that. So what that means is your policies are all there in place, but they don't actually enforce anything yet. And then you can look at the logs and say, okay, what happened when this login happened? Did it do what I expected it to do? Should I be worried about that? No. Okay, now we can turn it on. But the emergency account is kind of the get-out-of-jail-free card in that scenario. And the idea is that you want to make it hard to use that emergency account. Ideally, you want to have multiple people need to have access to make use of that account. Think of it back in the old, Cold War days when the two fellows down in the missile silo, they have to turn their keys simultaneously, and you need those two people to launch the missiles. It's kind of the same idea with the emergency account. You give half the password to one person, half the password to another person. Hopefully they have a secure password vault that they're keeping that in. I'm a big fan of 1Password, but pick whatever one you like and leverage it. And then those two people have to coordinate together to say, okay, let's put our passwords together, because this is something you should never use, but it's nice to know that you can if you need to. The other side of it is to make sure you got some notifications on that. So if somebody does use this account, every administrator in your organization knows about it, should already be aware of it, and if they're not, then that raises the alarm bell to say, hey, somebody's just compromised our emergency account, because it does have all the keys to the kingdom as part of that. So that's sort of the first thing. Make sure you get that structure in place so you don't lock yourself out and make yourself unpopular around your organization. The other is don't use your regular account as your administrator account. Create a separate cloud-only account. It shouldn't even be your domain admin account if you have one in your on-premise. It should be a completely separate cloud-only account. Next thing, there's a temptation to go crazy with the policies and build lots of different policies. You have to remember that if the person that's signing in doesn't hit any of those policies that you define, then it doesn't enforce anything. It's never going to cause an MFA to happen. They're just going to get in, and away they go from there. So, if you get too complex, it's sometimes difficult to understand, okay, have I actually covered off all the cases as part of that? I already mentioned the blocking the legacy authentication. Apply the policies to all the apps. Don't leave doors open from that point of view. And really think about three sets of users. You've got your administrators, your regular members, staff in your organization, and then your external guest users. And it should be three separate set of policies that apply to those people. So for your members, your regular admins as well as your general users, there should be a blanket requires MFA on all of those. It may have rules in there that says, hey, if I'm a regular user, I can have a persistent session, so when I close my browser and I relaunch, I can still see my corporate internet without having to sign back in again. That's convenient. But if I'm the global admin and I'm launching the Azure portal, I should probably go through that MFA challenge every time that I sign in. So you want to have a higher degree of protection on those admin accounts. If you've got particular geographies you're not expecting anybody ever from, you can do those geographic blocks as well. Sorry, question over here?
Yes. The point which is block legacy authentication protocol. So my understanding as of last year, Microsoft has already gone ahead and done that. So are we kind of off the hook from doing that?
So the question was, does Microsoft block legacy default for everybody? If you're not in the Azure AD Premium, if you're in the free or the 365, and you've left your security defaults turned on, which they are on by default, then legacy is blocked as part of that. I'm not clear that it's blocked in the Azure AD Premium unless you actually put a rule in to enforce that. Because there is the option, there's checkboxes there to say, does this rule apply to legacy protocols or not? And I'm assuming if you leave it off, you've left it open.
It's turned off, it's blocking it by default for new tenants. The Azure AD
Okay, so it's only for new tenants but that's still the security defaults, not the conditional access policies, is it?
Yeah, they're blocking it right up to 10.
Okay. Because I know we left that door open for far too long. We only closed it recently, and it was still open. I had one staff member that still had an ancient iOS app that was using legacy. I'm like, get off of that, because we're shutting this down.
Sorry, just a question.
Yeah.
So so the conditional access is like evaluated after the password. So if you're authenticating against Exchange with a legacy protocol, they're still able to get the password. Is that correct?
So the question is, the password authentication happens before the conditional access policy. Yeah, you've got to pass that first before the rules get evaluated. Sorry, was the scenario that you still had legacy open?
Yeah. So then they would know your password, and they would have that, but they would still need to figure out how to get past that.
I mean, you would have a valid authenticated connection at that point that you could leverage within Exchange itself, at least. Whether you could move laterally with that or not, I'm not sure.
Okay. So
Sorry if I'm not answering the question properly.
Turn it off at like the Exchange level too.
Yeah, the bottom line is you should just block it and not have it in there at all.
Do the conditional access policies, do they block it, or is it, do you need to block it?
Well, that was the question back and forth. I was under the understanding that you needed to explicitly block it. And I'm going to show you a very simple set in our dev tenant of conditional access policies, and one of them is the block legacy, which is a pretty straightforward one from that point of view. Actually, here, why don't we jump over, because I think it was only a slide or two away from jumping into that. So this is my dev tenant that I'm in here right now. So, I mean, this is the way I'm familiar with getting into Azure AD, is to go to portal.azure.com and then click on Azure AD, and I've got all my nav here on the left. You can also go to entra.microsoft.com now, and you'll get this pretty new modern looking nav on the left here. But if you notice, if I come down, say, into the users section and all users, I mean, it's almost like it's iframing part of the Azure AD portal into this new Entra portal as part of that, because this looks exactly the same as what I'm used to in the Azure portal through there. But for fun here, let's stay in the Entra one and see if I can navigate my way around through. So if I come into Protect and Secure, I've got a conditional access section here, which gets me to the main where I set up conditional access policies in Azure AD. So this particular one, like I said, this is my dev tenant. We've got just a couple of simple examples in here, but we've broken it up into users, admins, and we've got a couple different scenarios for guests that I'll get to a little later because they're a little bit more complex. This one here, the block legacy protocols. So if I look at this role here, so it's got a condition which says this rule triggers if you're coming through any legacy authentication client. And the result of that rule is not an MFA, it's a clear block. You know, just can't go any further, do not pass go, do not collect $200. Whereas if we look at the user role that we have in here, so I'm cheating a little bit. I'm actually using since this is my dev tenant, as my emergency account. So I've set up an exclude rule here to say, hey, don't include the emergency account in this particular rule. You know, typically that wouldn't be the account that you're regularly using. That should be your separate emergency account as part of that. I've also excluded guest and external users because I don't want them to fall through the regular MFA path for regular users from there. On the apps, we're including all apps. From a conditions point of view, we're only choosing the modern. So before we were looking at the legacy ones, this was applying to the modern ones and saying regular user coming in as part of this. We've got one control selected here which says require multi-factor authentication. And this is where you can get a lot more granular to say, hey, you know, do I need to be on a compliant device to do this, or an Azure AD join device, client apps, all those sorts of finer grained rules you can define through as part of that. And also if I come into the session controls, we haven't applied any of those through here, but to the question here, you know, you can have a continuous access evaluation to say, hey, I want to continuously reevaluate that as part of this. I want to use sign-in frequency. I want to allow or disallow the persistent browser session. So when somebody closes their browser, what is the behavior of that? So again, you can determine a lot of the behavior coming out of the application of this policy. And then my third one that I've got there is my MFA for admins, which, you know, in this example here is very similar. The only thing I've done is not allow the persistent browser session. I want somebody to re-authenticate if they relaunch the browser as global administrator and go through that as part of that. Okay. So yeah, we've talked about the admin rules and the member rules. The guests one, if you didn't do anything more than those three rules that I just showed you, because guests were excluded, none of your guests would go through MFA, which for some organizations is fine and others not. So you kind of need to decide what makes sense from that point of view. You know, what is the user experience and support cost? What's the risk and and impact of somebody compromising that from a guest point of view, and how do we decide that? One thing that we started using is sensitivity labels. It's a preview feature still in Azure AD, and it only works with certain features like SharePoint Online, where you can classify your content to say, okay, what's the sensitivity level of this content? And if somebody's trying to access that content, even as a guest, maybe I should take them through MFA. But if they're doing anything else in there, it's lower sensitivity, I'm not going to worry about MFA. So you can start to get granular as you went through there. We'd actually wanted to use it with a US client that's in the GCC, the government cloud community, which is sort of the private Microsoft cloud for government. They're further behind, like they don't get all the latest features that the commercial cloud gets, so they didn't actually have that feature there. But I'm assuming ultimately that will become available there as well. Okay, so we've already done the walkthrough on that side and the Entra side. This is a general page, so a lot of my talks are actually more B2B and external focused, because that's what our business is about, is working with guests. And I put this page together. I think it's a useful thing, even if you're not doing B2B scenario. It's just, here's a bunch of the important links, and it'll be available in the deck. And these are live links that'll take you to the appropriate spots in the Azure portal, whichever portal you're signed into from there, so you can get into those spots. So things like, where do I go for conditional access? Okay, sometimes it's tough to navigate through the Azure portal. That gets you into there from there. We won't have time to go through all of these areas, but I do want to touch on some of them. You know, even simple things like company branding in terms of use. When somebody's coming to your tenant, particularly as an external, but even as one of your staff, should they see Microsoft in the branding, or should they see your organization? It's actually really easy to set up your branding. You can upload your logo, some copy for different scenarios. You know, you do that, you publish it, and now anybody who's authenticating through your Azure AD is going to see that as part of that. You can also put a terms of use in to say, hey, you know, before you use our systems, you need to agree to this terms of use. This is particularly important for external users because they haven't gone through a corporate onboarding, they haven't signed an employment agreement with you. So this is a nice way to get that terms of use agreement in as part of that. And you can define, you know, is it assigned once and you never have to do it ever again in your life? Do I have to do it once a year? Or I've published a new terms of use and I want everybody, even if they signed it before, to have to come through it again. That can all be part of that as part of there. The monitoring, the sign-in logs, the audit logs, I've actually got some open source stuff I'm going to talk about at the end. We've built a data harvester that pulls some of the audit data and some of the Azure AD stuff out into an Azure storage account, and then we have a Power BI report that works against that.
Yeah, say you do not have MFA enabled, and you have a password policy, so like on so many attempts, the account is frozen, right?
Right.
How do you prevent denial of service attacks that would actually leverage that to lock accounts?
I don't know. Did everybody hear the question? So we don't have, it doesn't really matter whether you have MFA or not. People are brute force.
I would think if you had MFA enabled, you know, the one-time password, for example, would be sent before you had a chance to attempt an invalid password. No?
Sorry, this is the guest scenario or the staff scenario? If I'm staff, or I'm nefarious attacking a staff account, and I'm just using password spray to try and get in, yes, at some point that account is going to get locked. And your question is, how do you prevent that from being a broader denial of service? If they know the 100 email addresses at your organization and they just hammer all of them until they're all locked, they've kind of screwed you. Actually, I'm going to put it out to the field. Anybody got thoughts on that one?
There's a lockout period where you shorten that lockout period, so I guess somebody might get locked out.
Like for a 10-minute window?
But you shorten that down.
Right. I mean, it would still,
Disrupt business.
it would absolutely still disrupt business. Yeah, I don't know if there's an absolute way to do that. I don't know if the P2 identity protection stuff detects those types of activities and is better at blocking those. It'd be interesting to dig into.
Block the network connectivity.
Sorry?
Block the network connectivity so that where they see the attack coming in.
The problem is you don't have visibility of that. The question was, could you block the network activity? Like you as the organization don't see the IP that's coming into the Microsoft login because it's in that shared service. Microsoft, I mean, they've got a lot of risk people and security folks. They may see that and do that on your behalf. I'm not sure. There was a question way back there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, typically you throw up like a captcha or some sort of challenge to prevent that from being automated across your entire company.
Yeah, again, that login form's not under your control, unfortunately. It's a Microsoft asset.
So
Yeah, so the question was if there's no password sync back and people are just brute forcing the passwords, you're not seeing a lockout happen in the cloud. I'm not sure if there's a setting for that, or again, that's part of the Azure AD Premium stuff. Sorry, question or comment there?
Yeah, just to add on to the gentleman's question here. So from what I've seen, a lot of the brute force attacks that I've seen are through legacy off. So if you didn't set that conditional access policy, would that stop it in its tracks, or would it be susceptible to getting brute force?
So the question was, the brute force attacks are coming through legacy. If you had the legacy blocked, I'm actually not sure what the attacker sees as a response to that. I mean, they're never going to have a successful password spray result back, because it's just going to get blocked every time as part of that blocking legacy authentication.
You'll get the account lockdowns.
I mean, one rule of security is tell as little back to the person that failed as part of that. I'm not sure actually what Microsoft tells back to you when you try and do a valid or an invalid password to a legacy protocol. Okay, good question. Sorry, I can't answer all of them, but I'll do my best as we go through. Some of the other things in here, the external collaboration settings and cross-tenant settings, we're going to get into those a little later, although we're running a little tight on time. There's some interesting stuff around B2B collaboration, and particularly B2B Direct Connect, that allows you to actually connect two Azure ADs together, primarily for team shared channels, where you want to have channels shared between organizations, and people don't have to switch their Teams tenant in order to leverage that. It's a really nice feature that just came out in the last couple of months or so. But let's come back to the sensitivity, and particularly on the guest side, but you can leverage this internally as well, and how you can make that part of your conditional access policies. So Purview is the new brand for the compliance side of the Microsoft house, and it's a big beast. Like, it's not just sensitivity, it's retention labels, it's e-discovery. There's a lot of features in there as part of that. We're just going to look at that little sliver of it, which is the sensitivity label side of it. And even within that little piece, they managed to make it really confusing. Basically what you have, if we look here, let's see if I can get my mouse to point up here. So in Purview, you create a sensitivity label. It's just a piece of text. It doesn't have any rules associated with it. You're just creating a label that can be applied to things. It's the rules that drive off of that define what it actually does. And then over in Azure AD, you have to create what's called an authentication context. And it's a container bucket that the sensitivity label then belongs to. And then when you're writing your conditional access policy, the conditional access policy can reference that authentication context. I don't know why they didn't let you just go straight from the conditional access policy to the sensitivity label, but they put that piece in between from a structure and a setup point of view. So if we come over to Purview here, and let's go into our information protection. I may need to refresh browser because this has been open for a while. Bear with me one sec. So actually, let me come over here because I actually need to start in the conditional access section first, because I have to create that authentication context. So in the spot where you're defining your conditional access policies, you'll notice if you're in a commercial tenant, this preview authentication context section here. And basically you create a context. So I can go into this one here, and it's really just a placeholder bucket. There's not a lot to define in there as part of it, but it's something you reference from your sensitivity label and also reference from your conditional access policy. So let's see if Purview is going to cooperate with me here. Wi-Fi's kind of been, good and bad today. I don't know how everybody else's experience has been as part of that. I may not be able to show you that piece. Okay, let's just assume that we've created a label in Purview for that sensitivity. Now there's a lot of things you can do with that label when you're setting it up. You can define policies, whether it gets auto-applied or not. You can have data loss protection rules that say, hey, if I see this PCI data I'm going to apply this sensitivity label to it. This one that we used here was fairly simple. It was only to be intended to use to categorize sites in SharePoint. Oh, there it's coming back. Okay, so if I look at my labels, and we've got this sensitive SP content label down here, which I can edit. So you'll see a lot of control around how you're going to use this label. Am I going to apply it to individual items like an email or a document? No, in this scenario, we just wanted to apply it to groups and sites, which could be Teams, Microsoft 365 groups, SharePoint sites. You can even apply it to SQL data and such as part of that. Of course, I'm not doing items, so I don't have the option to encrypt or mark them, but you could actually encrypt the documents or the emails as part of that labeling process as well. And we're going to use this in our conditional access settings, so we need that turned on. We don't need any of the schematized side of things, and we're not going to be doing any auto labeling as part of this for now. I'm just going to cancel it because I don't want to actually make changes as part of that. So I've defined my label now. So if I come over to my SharePoint site, we have an aptly named site called Sensitive. Could be called whatever you want. And you'll actually notice right up here that label, that sensitive SP content that I created in Purview, because I've applied it to this site, shows right up in the header here. And the spot where I do that, if I come into my site information, yet another site I may need to refresh. Basically, there's a drop down there that lets you pick the label and apply it to that SharePoint site. And then if I come back to my conditional access policies, if that works for me, I've got a policy there for guests accessing sensitive content. And the idea is if somebody's going to that sites/sensitive site, which I've labeled as a sensitive site, the conditional access policy says, hey, you're trying to go to a site that's labeled as sensitive, I'm going to trigger this conditional access policy and enforce an MFA as part of that. If that guest has never gone through MFA on your tenant before, it will require them to go through an MFA registration and set up the app and such and go forward from there, and then it'd have access to that content. And that should happen even after initial authentication. If that person went to, say, your training portal and took a course, and I didn't need to go through MFA as part of that, and then in that same session, go to that other URL, site/sensitive, it should trigger a re-authentication as part of that, and an MFA as part of that. The other piece that's important, though, here, if we come back to external identities, I know this part better in the Azure portal, so I'm going to come over here. There's a cross-tenant access settings. This is really important for MFA with guests. So if I look at, say, just this configured inbound access right here, sorry, that's not working for me. Let me try the default settings. You have the option in here under the trust settings. There's a number of things that you can do, but one of the interesting things you can do is trust MFA from the other tenant. So if you've invited somebody in as a guest, they're hitting sensitive content, you want them to go through an MFA, you don't want them to have to do two MFAs, one for their organization and then another one for yours. If you trust that that other organization has set up MFA appropriately, you can check this checkbox and that'll come through as part of the bearer token in their authentication. And your tenant will say, hey, I see in the token that they passed MFA, they're fine, I don't need to take them through a second MFA as part of that. And, which is great because then they never need to register a device. They've already got it registered on their own home tenant as part of that. I'm in the default settings here right now, which would apply to every external tenant coming into my tenant. You can also create profiles for each individual tenant, either to include or exclude from that role point of view. So you have to decide, hey, do I want to turn that trust of MFA on for everybody and maybe turn it off for a few if I feel the need for that, or do I want to flip it the other way and say I'm going to whitelist rather than blacklist and only bring in certain organizations that I've already vetted that maybe we do a lot of partnering work with and I don't want to force them to go through an MFA as part of that. You can also trust compliant devices and Azure AD join devices, so if you were using those rules as part of your conditional access policies, you could enforce that onto your partners as well. You probably see this scenario more in a M&A type of scenario where you've got company A's bought company B, they're still running as two independent tenants, but they're kind of one company, and you want sort of a master set of rules that apply across that. You could use these cross-tenant settings to achieve that from that point of view. So that's the sensitivity labeling side of it. We've done the walkthrough there. Yeah, I do want to mention on the Azure AD B2B resources side, so actually if you go to a browser here for a sec, quickest way to get in is eum.co, hit enter, it'll redirect you to our site from there, and you'll see a spot here with Azure AD B2B resources. One of the things that I wanted to talk about here is we've got this Power BI dashboard. We don't have time to get too deep into it, but basically it's a harvester that harvests data out of your Azure Active Directory, puts it in an Azure storage account in your tenant, and then you can light up a Power BI dashboard. We provide all that for free. You can download it. It's all up in GitHub. And you basically get a nice little dashboard here that can show you what's going on in your tenant. Things like sign-in activity failures, where are people coming in from around the world. When it's just using all the data that's already there in Azure AD, it just provides a nice visualization that makes it a little easier to work with from that point of view. I see this as sort of the poor man's way to do access reviews as well. You know, it's easy to identify things like people that haven't signed into the tenant in a long time, or people that don't belong to any groups, particularly with guests. You invite somebody, you know, they do something for 2 weeks, then they're gone, but their account lives there forever. So how do you pick those up, clean those up, and pull them out of your system? You could use Azure AD P2. You could do the same thing here with this as well. Yeah, so that's the architecture. Basically, there's a C#.NET app that deploys into your tenant, or you can actually run it just on your local system, and it pushes its data up into some Azure table storage. You also wire up your diagnostic logs. So you have the ability to take all the diagnostic logs that are in Azure AD and ship them into a blob storage quite easily. It's just a couple of clicks to set that up. It's nice from a retention point of view, because if you're not on the premium Azure AD, your audit logs for Azure AD, I think, are only held for 30 or maybe 90 days, and then they're purged from there. So if you want a history of that, you can set that up fairly easily, and blob storage is cheap, so it doesn't cost much to do that. And then the Power BI report itself just reaches into that Azure storage account to be able to render out its visualizations from there. I mean, again, coming back, our focus when we built this was more around external guests rather than your users as a whole. You know, we found that there were problems that we were seeing with guest management, often because of things on the other tenant side. You know, you can't directly control that, but if you can see it, that works well. You know, you may have accounts in your tenant that they're supposed to show as either a member or a guest when you're in your Azure AD users. Sometimes they don't show either because they're so old, they predate when that qualification existed from that point of view. The mismatch between the email and UPN, I mean, this is something you should probably think about in your own tenant to make your staff's life easier if they want to collaborate with a different tenant. There's a security argument that says your user principal name should be different than your email address. So if somebody has your email address, they don't automatically get your UPN, which sounds great from a security point of view, but when you're signing in, when you first sign in and start the login process as a guest in somebody's tenant, you have to provide your email address, and then when you get to the next page, it wants your user principal name, and regular users are often confused by that, and they just can't get past that, and they can't get logged in as part of that. Once they've done it once, then your tenant knows about that difference. For privacy reasons before that, it can't discover that, and you can't see that. But once it knows it, then it can optimize that login experience. But that first login as a guest is difficult if you set up your tenant that way. Obviously, you need an email address in there. You can create an Azure AD account that doesn't have an email. It's not going to work from a guest registration point of view. This one here, the unaccepted invitations, that was back in the day when you invited somebody as a guest in Azure AD, Microsoft sent an invitation email, and it had a special GUID and a code and a link that they had to click on to accept that invitation. If they didn't do that, their account would never work and they'd never get in. If you invited somebody, more than 2 years ago, and that process was in place in your tenant, and they never accepted it, even today when they try and get in, they won't get past that. But there's some PowerShell, there's some new features that they brought out this summer. You can actually clean that up and sort it out in your tenant from that. One of the ones that we didn't have on here that caused us grief with one client was a big partner of theirs had started a Microsoft implementation and then decided, no, we're going to go the G Suite way, and they left this kind of half-baked Azure AD tenant in their environment, and they never cleaned it up. So when we started inviting guests in from that organization, which was a major utility company here in Canada, some of them could get in because they still had 2-year-old synced password hashes in there that worked. Other ones couldn't. It took us a while to figure out, okay, you've got this zombie Azure AD that nobody's managing anymore. We just need to rip it out completely. Once we got rid of it altogether, then they were happy and things worked well from that point of view. The other one that Microsoft doesn't let you do anymore is you used to be able to create a Microsoft account under your own email address. And I made the mistake of doing this myself. I used my peter@envisioning.com, which was my UPN for my Azure AD, also as my personal Microsoft account. And then you get that, hey, do you want to sign in with your work account or your personal account? It breaks all sorts of things. They don't let you do that anymore, but there's still lots of legacy accounts out from that point of view. So part of that Power BI was to discover these sorts of things and look at that from that perspective. I've only got about 3 minutes left here. This is a cool feature I did want to talk about, the Teams Connect, the ability to set up a direct connection. It's actually back in this same external identities section here. So you'll see there's B2B direct connect and collaboration settings where you can allow or block B2B connections. The direct connect ones actually allow you to bring the other tenant effectively into your tenant. It doesn't create that shadow account like the guest accounts, but it means you can invite those people into your Teams shared channel. They can stay in Teams in their home tenant, and you stay in your home tenant, and you both see it in your list of teams, you both see it in your activity feed. There's no, oh, I need to switch to that tenant in my Teams client to see things that people have sent me, which is the biggest issue of cross-tenant teams I've seen. Until that feature came out, I recommended people just don't invite guests to your teams. It doesn't work well from that perspective. Let me do a blitzkrieg through the last little bit here. I know I was going to talk about licensing. I didn't get too far with that. I actually find the Microsoft 365 Admin Center a handy spot to figure out some pricing stuff. You can go in as if you're going to buy products, and it'll give you your pricing as part of that, because I find going through the actual pricing sheets on the Microsoft websites is way too confusing from that perspective. I didn't expect you to read this slide. I just wanted to kind of illustrate, if you want that sensitivity labeling feature, these are all the different plan ways that you can do that, and that's only one little piece of Microsoft 365. So they do make it very complex. This looks ugly, but it's actually a super useful resource. Aaron Dinich is a Microsoft full-time employee, and hasn't done it for a few months now, but he was on a schedule where every month he released a new, basically Venn diagram map that says, hey, I'm in Microsoft 365 E3, and I have the EMS E5 add-on. What features do I get as part of that? You can map that all out as part of that. In fact, if you go over to his website here, and I just go into, say, Enterprise Simple, there's the diagram there, and you can see the different product SKUs across the side, across the top. It's pretty neat how he's fit it all together, and it makes it much more understandable on how to map those licensing pieces through. Last piece, external identity licensing. If you're bringing in external users, there used to be this concept that if you wanted to use premium features, you had to buy one internal license for every 5 guests that you brought in. That disappeared about a year ago. Basically, if you've got 50,000 or less monthly active guests coming in, they don't need to pay anything. They get the same features. So if you've got Azure AD P2 for your staff, you can use all those same features with your guests as part of that. And even beyond that, it's very cost effective from that point of view. Okay. I only left about 60 seconds, but we had good questions that we were going through there. I'm happy to stay back, so if you want to come up and ask questions from there, feel free to do so. And thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.